On. Yeah, here we go. Ah, damn it. Come on. Ah, start here. Oh, here. Come on. Okay.
Thinking about it.
Well, at least you can hear me. I
Yeah.
this microphone. All right. Welcome to Weekly Marx, 6 August 2025. We're looking at the manuscripts of 1864 to 65 by Marx, the economic manuscripts, which are essentially the foundation for, or the pre-Engels version of book three, volume three, that is, of Capital. And so it has Capital before it gets edited by Marx, which is, I mean, by Engels, which I think is useful, may be useful, may not be useful. But I thought I'd do it anyway because the Moseley folks translation and editing doesn't get enough attention. I think because it got kind of snowballed by Heinrich, but that's just an opinion. I think it's worth reading because I think, besides the fact that I want to read it, and I tried to read it and tried to do stuff with it, and it needs to be made more intelligible, and I think it's worth reading. And mainly because the idea of differential rent and absolute ground rent are important in the bigger picture. That is, that I think that you can assert that there are forms or types of rent that need to be fully articulated. And yes, they are articulated in a variety of texts, but there are only a couple of texts that have taken these Marxist rent issues a little further, and I think more usefully. So I think we're going to continue on in that little vein there. All right. It's 418 in the original text, 737 in the Moseley text. I couldn't remember where I left off last time, and it's this is chapter 6, and it goes on for about 150 pages. So your mileage may vary. Absolute ground rent. Differential rent should be treated before this section under B, and in examining absolute ground rent under C, we presuppose this prior treatment. The transition from differential rent to absolute rent is to be made in the following way. In our analysis of differential rent, we proceeded from the premise that the worst land pays no ground rent, or to put it more generally, land pays ground rent only when the individual production price of its product is below the production price that governs the market, giving rise to a surplus profit that is transformed into rent. Now, the first thing to note here is that the law of differential rent as differential rent is entirely independent of the correctness or incorrectness of that premise. If we call the general production price that governs the market P, then for the product of the worst type of land, remember that he's following on Ricardo, P coincides with its individual real production price, i.e., the price of the product pays for the constant and variable capital consumed in the course of production plus the average profit equals which is the same as the profit of the enterprise plus interest. Rent here is zero. The individual production price of the next better type of land, remember, we're still doing kind of Ricardian stuff here, land of the second class, capital 2, equals Roman numeral 2 equals P prime, and P is greater than P prime, i.e. P pays for more than the actual production price of the product of land in class 2, Roman numeral 2. Now let P minus P, or P dash P prime, equals delta, semicolon delta, the excess of P over P prime is thus the surplus profit made by the farmer in class 2. This is transformed into rent to be paid to the landowner. For the third class of land, let the actual production price be P double prime, so that P minus P double prime equals 2 delta, semicolon. This 2 delta is now transformed into rent. Similarly, for the fourth class, the individual production price is 2 double prime, and P minus P double prime equals 3 delta. Prior one, I can't read it. I'm sorry. I think it's, well, anyway. Your mileage may vary, transferred into rent, and so on. Let us assume that the premise of zero rent for land in the first class, Roman numeral 1, the price of its product being P plus 0 is incorrect. Instead, say that it pays a rent equals R. Two things then follow. Firstly, the price of the product of class Roman numeral 1, land, would not be governed by its price of production, but would contain a surplus over and above this. It would be P plus R. 4, assuming the capitalist mode of production in its normal condition, i.e. assuming that the surplus R that the farmer pays to the landowner is neither a deduction from wages nor from the average profit of capital, he can pay it only by selling his product above its price of production, so that it would yield him a surplus profit if he did not have to part with this surplus to the landowner in the form of rent. Whew. The governing market price of the total product on the market from all types of land would then not be the price of production that capital generally yields in all spheres of production, i.e. a price equal to the outlays plus the average profit. It would be this production price plus the rent, that is P plus R, rather than just P. For the price of the product in class Roman numeral 1, land, always represents the limit of the governing general market price, the price at which the total product can be supplied, and to this extent, it governs the price of this total product. Secondly, however, we're on, to remind you, we're on page 738. Secondly, however, in this case, even though the general price of the product of the land would be basically modified, the law of differential rent would not in any way be thereby abolished. 4, if the price of the product of class Roman numeral 1, and therefore the general market price, was P plus R, the price for classes Roman numerals 2, 3, and 4, etc., would be P plus R2 also. But since for class Roman numeral 2, P dash P prime equals delta, P plus R minus P prime plus R in brackets, P plus R in brackets, minus P plus R, P prime plus R in bracket, would also equal delta. And similarly, for class Roman numeral 3, P minus P double prime equals P plus R in brackets minus P double prime plus R in brackets equals 2 delta. For class 4, P minus P double prime equals P plus R double minus P double prime, I think it's triple prime actually, plus R equals 3 delta, etc. Anyway, the differential rent would thus be the same as before and would be governed by the same law, even though the rent contained an element independent of the law, of this law, and underwent a general rise together with the price of the product. It follows from this that whatever the price, whatever the rent, it follows from this that whatever the rent on the least fertile types of land might be, not only is the law of differential rent independent of it, but the only way to grasp the true character of differential rent itself is to set the type for type 1, Roman numeral 1, land at 0. Now, whether it really is 0 or greater than 0 is immaterial. As far as the differential rent is concerned, it does not need to be taken into account. Boy, that was a lot of work. The law of differential rent is thus unaffected by the result of the following analysis. If we now investigate more closely the basis of the assumption that the product of the poorest land, type Roman numeral 1, pays no rent, we get the following result. If the market price of the product, say corn, reaches such a level that an additional advance of capital invested in type Roman numeral 1 land pays the customary price of production, i.e., yields the customary average profit on the capital, this condition is sufficient for the investment of additional capital on type Roman numeral 1 land. That is to say, this condition is sufficient for the capitalist to invest new capital at the customary profit and to valorize it in the normal way. To the extent that he has to decide as a capitalist, the capitalist farmer on type 1 land can cultivate under these conditions. The condition for the valorization of capital as capital on type 1 land is now present, but it in no way follows from the premise that capital could now be invested by the farmer on type 1 land under the average valorization conditions of capital if he had no rent to pay, that this land in type 1 is now immediately at the farmer's disposal as a field of application for his capital. The fact that the farmer could valorize his capital at the customary profit if he paid no rent is absolutely no reason for the landowner to lease out his land to the farmer for nothing. And to be so philanthropic or altruistic to his client as to extend him a credit gratuit. This assumption would involve abstracting from landed property, abolishing landed property, whose very existence is a barrier to the investment of capital and its unrestricted valorization on the land, a barrier that in no way collapses in the face of the farmer's reflection that the level of corn prices would enable him to obtain the customary profit on his capital by exploiting type 1 land, as long as he did not pay any rent, i.e., if he could actually treat landed property as non-existent. Differential rent presupposes precisely the monopoly of landed property. That's a long way to get there. Landed property as a barrier to capital, for otherwise the surplus profit would not be transformed into ground rent and would not accrue to the landlord instead of to the farmer. And landed property remains such a barrier even when rent in the form of differential rent disappears, i.e. on type 1 land. If we consider the cases where capital investment on the land can take place without payment of rent in a country of capitalist production, we shall find that they all involved a factual, if not also a legal, abolition of landed property, an abolition that can occur under very special conditions of an accidental nature. Firstly, if the landowner is himself a capitalist or the capitalist himself a landowner. In this case, he can cultivate his land himself as soon as the market price has risen sufficiently to obtain the price of production from land, which at present belongs to type 1, i.e. to replace the capital advance plus the average profit. And why? Because as far as he's concerned, landed property does not set any barrier to the investment of his capital. He can treat the land as a simple natural element and let his decision be determined exclusively by considering the valorization of his capital by considerations. Such cases do exist in practice, but only as exceptions. Just as the capitalist cultivation of the land assumes a separation between functioning capital and landed property, so it generally rules out self-cultivation by the landed proprietor. We can see immediately that this is purely accidental. If an increased demand for corn requires the cultivation of a greater type of type 1 land than is to be found in the hands of self-cultivating proprietors, i.e., if one part of it has to be leased in order to be cultivated at all, this hypothetical abolition of the barrier that landed property places to the investment of capital immediately falls to the ground.
And
Yes, did I?
your audio just dropped down. I can still hear it, but it's pretty low.
Damn it. Thank you. See if I can fix this. Oh, yes, I can see. Damn it. Come on. Come on. How about now?
Much better. Yay.
Alrighty. Sorry.
Thank you. No problem.
Just as the Start again. Just as the capitalist cultivation of the land assumes a separation between functioning capital and landed property, so it generally rules out self-cultivation by the landed proprietor. We can see immediately this is purely accidental. If an increased demand for corn requires the cultivation of a greater type of type 1 land than is to be found in the hands of self-cultivating proprietors, i.e., if one part of it has to be leased in order to be cultivated at all, this hypothetical abolition of the barrier that landed property places to the investment of capital immediately falls to the ground. It is an absurd contradiction to start from the separation between tenant farmer and landowner and between capital and land, which corresponds to the capitalist mode of production, and thus to assume the reverse as a general rule, i.e., to assume that the landowner is a self-cultivator wherever and to the extent that capital would draw no rent from cultivating the land if there were no landed property existing independently vis-a-vis capital. See the passage of rent of mines in Adam Smith, footnote 25. This abolition of landed property is accidental. It may occur or it may not. Secondly, the contents of a lease may include particular pieces of land that pay no rent at the given level of market prices and are therefore rented out for nothing, although they are not viewed in this light by the landowner, since what he has his eye on is the total rental of the land leased and not the particular rent of individual component parts. In this case, the rent paid by the farmer for the investment of his capital disappears as far as those non-rent bearing pieces of his farm are concerned, and with it, landed property is a barrier to the application of capital, and this is, moreover, by contract with the landowner himself. But the only reason why he pays no rent for these pieces of land is that he does pay rent for the land to which they are an accessory. In this case, the combination presupposed is precisely one in which he does not need to resort to the worst land, that is, land of type 1, as an independent and new source of production in order to make up for the missing supply. Instead, this land of type 1 simply forms an element of the land inseparable from the better type of land. But the case that is to be investigated here is precisely that in which tracts of type 1 land are farmed independently and have to be independently leased out under the general preconditions of the capitalist mode of production. That's a long way to talk about, what a transaction costs. Anyway, thirdly, a farmer may invest extra capital on his existing leasehold property, even though at the existing market prices, the additional product obtained in this way simply yields him the price of production, the customary profit, and does not enable him to pay an additional rent. Thus, for one part of the capital invested on the land, he does pay ground rent. For the other part, he does not. But we can see from the following analysis how little this solves the problem. If the market price and also the fertility of the soil enables him to obtain a surplus yield with the additional capital, which, like the old capital, yields him a surplus profit as well as the price of production, then he pockets this profit himself for the duration of the lease. And why? Why? Because as long as the tenancy lasts contractually, the barrier that landed property places to the investment of his capital in the land has been removed. This raised an interesting question about grazing rights. Anyway, that's an aside. Yet, the mere fact that in order to secure this surplus profit, he must take on additional worse land and lease it separately shows irrefutably that the investment of additional capital on the old land is not sufficient to produce the increased supply that is needed. The one assumption rules out the other. Now, one could say that the rent of the worst type of land, type 1, is itself a differential rent compared with the land cultivated by its own proprietor, even though this occurs only as a chance exception. You can make this argument for art as well, but anyway, that's another question. Or with additional capital investment on the old leaseholds that do not yield any rent. This, however, would be a differential rent that did not arise from the differing fertility of different types of land, and therefore did not presuppose that type 1 land paid no rent and that its product was sold at the price of production. Moreover, whether additional capital investments on the same leasehold land yield rent or not is as completely immaterial in determining whether the land in type 1 is newly taken on pays rent or not, as it is immaterial, for example, for investment in a new and independent factory, whether another manufacturer in the same branch of production invests a part of his capital in interest-bearing paper, because this cannot be completely valorized in his own business, or whether he makes extensions to his factory that do not yield him the full profit. Well, that's a long sentence. Although they do yield more than the interest. As far as he's concerned, this is a secondary matter. But any new enterprise must yield the average profit, and it is set up on this expectation. Additional capital investments on the old leasehold properties, moreover, and the additional cultivation of new land of type 1 set barriers to each other. That's an interesting distinction. The limit up to which additional capital can be invested on the same leasehold under less favorable conditions of production is given by the competing new investments on type 1 land. On the other hand, the rent that this type of land can yield is limited by the competing additional capital investments on the old leasehold. So, it's kind of getting at this business about what happens when you build something. But none of these prevarications solves the problem, which, put simply, is as follows. Let us assume that the market price for the products of the soil is sufficient for portions of type 1 land to be taken into cultivation, and for the capital invested to obtain the production price of the products from these new fields, i.e., the replacement of the capital that has been consumed plus the average profit. Let us assume, therefore, that the conditions for a normal valorization of capital on type 1 land are present. Now, will this suffice? Can this capital really then be invested? Or must the market price rise high enough for even the worst land to yield a rent? In other words, does the monopoly of landed property place a barrier to the investment of capital that would not be present from capital's own standpoint without the existence of this monopoly? The very terms of the question itself show how, if, for example, there are additional capital investments on old leaseholds that yield no rent at the prevailing market price, but simply the average profit, this in no way solves the problem of whether capital can now be invested on type 1 land, which would similarly yield the average profit but no rent. This is precisely the question. It's clear from the need to take on new land into cultivation that the additional capital investments which yield no rent do not satisfy the demand. If the additional cultivation of land on type 1 is undertaken only insofar as this yields rent, i.e. yields more than the price of production, no more than 2 cases are possible. Well, that's an interesting criterion. Either the market price must rise so far that even the final additional capital investments on the old leaseholds yield rent, whether this surplus profit is pocketed by the farmer or the landlord. This rise in price and yield of rent from the final additional capital investments would then be the result of the impossibility of cultivating land of type 1 unless rent is obtained thereby. Well, that was a long way to get there. 4. If the price of production, the yield of the average profit, pure and simple, was sufficient to induce cultivation, the price would not have risen so high, and new lands would have already come into competition as soon as they yielded these prices of production, and no more. The additional capital investments on the old leaseholds that yielded no rent would then be faced with competition from the capital investments on land of type 1 that likewise yield no rent. Or, alternatively, The final capital investments on the old leaseholds yield no rent, but the market price has still risen high enough for land of type 1 to be taken up and to yield rent. In this case, the additional capital investment that yielded no rent was possible only because the land of type 1 could not be cultivated until the market price allowed it to pay rent. Wow. In the absence of this condition, it would already have been cultivated at a lower price level than those later investments of capital on the old leaseholds that need the high market price to yield the customary profit without rent could not have taken place. Oh, man. And given the high market price, they yield only the average profit. At a lower price, which would occur when the price of production allowed land of type 1 to be cultivated, these investments would not have yielded this profit, and so they could not have taken place at all under these conditions. The rent of type 1 land would thus form a differential rent compared with these capital investments on the old leaseholds that yield no rent. But the fact that it yields a differential rent of this kind is simply the result of its not being available for cultivation at all unless it yields a rent, i.e., unless there's a need for this rent which is not determined by any difference in the types of land, and which places a barrier to the possible investment of additional capitals on the old leaseholds. In both cases, the rent of type 1 land would not be the result of a rise in corn prices, but the opposite of this. That is, the fact that the worst soil has to yield a rent for cultivation to be possible at all would be the reason why corn prices rise to the point at which this condition can be fulfilled. It's a long way to get there. Whenever we say that type 1 land pays no rent on the assumption that the corn price is governed by the price of production, we mean rent as a specific category. If the lease price paid by the farmer involves a deduction from the normal wages of his workers or from his own normal average profit, he does not pay any rent as an independent component of the price of his commodity, distinct from wages and profit. Now, we've already noted that this constantly happens in practice. Insofar as agricultural wages in a country are generally depressed below normal average levels so that there's a deduction from wages, with a part of the wage generally going into rent, this is not an exceptional case for the farmer on the worst land. His price of production already includes these low wages as a constituent item, and so the sale of the product at its price of production does not enable the farmer of this land to pay a rent. The landlord can even lease out his land to a worker who's content to pay him in the form of rent, everything or the greatest part of it that the sale price yields him over and above his wages. In none of these cases is a genuine rent paid, even though a lease price is. Where relations corresponding to the capitalist mode of production exist, however, rent and lease price must coincide. This is precisely the normal relationship which is examined here, which is to be examined here. If our problem is not solved by the cases considered above, i.e., those in which capital investments can be made on the land in the capitalist mode of production without yielding rent, still less is it solved by making reference to colonial conditions. All right. And speaking here of colonies, we refer always to colonies proper, that is, agricultural colonies. What makes a colony is not just the amount of fertile land to be found in the natural condition. It is rather the circumstance that this land has not been appropriated. It has not been subsumed under landed property. This makes all the difference between the old countries and the colonies. As far as land is concerned, the legal or factual non-existence of landed property, as Wakefield, footnote 27, correctly notes, a fact already discovered long before him by Mirabeau, the physiocrat, footnote 28, and other earlier economists. It is completely immaterial here whether the colonists appropriate the land directly or whether they merely pay the state a tax in return for a valid legal title under the guise of a nominal land price. It is also immaterial that colonists already settled may be the legal owners of the land. Those poor indigenous folks. Here, landed property actually forms no barrier to the investment of capital or of labor without capital. The seizure of part of the land by colonists already established does not prevent the newcomers from making new land into a field of investment for their own capital or their labor. Even in colonies, grants of big, uncultivated estates to particular individuals as their private property constitute a burdensome restriction on colonization, since they restrict the field of employment. And if this were done on a large scale, it would destroy the colony's character as a colony, and it would still do nothing to establish the conditions enjoyed by countries of ancient civilization there, as Wakefield has correctly remarked, footnote 29. This point did not prevent the same Wakefield from advocating the establishment of an artificial land price in the colonies, footnote 30. Now, thus, if we want to investigate how landed property affects the prices of its product and rent in cases where it restricts the land as a field of employment for capital to be invested, it is completely absurd to refer to free bourgeois colonies where neither the capitalist mode of production exists in agriculture nor the form of landed property corresponding to it. Indeed, where landed property does not exist at all in practice. This is what Ricardo does, for example, in his chapter on rent, footnote 31. He starts by saying that he intends to analyze the effect of the appropriation of land on the value of its products, but immediately goes on to take the colonies as his illustration, assuming that land there is in a relatively elementary state and its exploitation not impeded by the monopoly of landed property. Well, that's an important point. Legal ownership of the land by itself does not give the proprietor any ground rent. Certainly does give him the power, however, to withdraw his land from cultivation until economic conditions permit a valorization of it that yields him a surplus, whether the land is used for agriculture proper or for productive purposes such as building, etc. This is what the former well, anyway, this has to do with, for example, Nunes and his claim that he's a farmer, even though he has one little plot of land, one acre that he doesn't do anything with. Anyway, he can neither increase nor reduce the absolute quantity of this field of employment, but he can affect the quantity of it on the market. It is a characteristic fact, therefore, and one which Fourier already noticed, that in all civilized countries, a relatively significant portion of the land always remains uncultivated, footnote 32. Now, assuming then that demand requires the taking up of new land, which is less fertile than that previously cultivated, will the owner of this land lease it for nothing just because the market price of its product has risen high enough for capital investment to pay the farmer the price of production and thus yield him the customary profit? By no means. The capital investment must yield him a rent. He leases only when a lease price can be paid. The market price must therefore have risen above the price of production to P plus R so that a rent can be paid to the landowner. Since by our assumption, land and property does not bring anything without being leased, unleased land being economically worthless, a small rise in the market price above the price of production is sufficient to bring new land of the poorest kind onto the market. I think, whatever, anyway. The question now arises whether it follows from the ground rent of the poorest land, which cannot be derived from any difference in fertility, that the price of its product is necessarily a monopoly price in the customary sense, or a price that includes rent in the form of a tax levied in this case by the landowner rather than the state. Now, it's obvious that this tax has its given economic limits. It's limited by additional capital investments on the old leaseholds, by competition from foreign agricultural products, we're assuming free trade, by competition between landed proprietors within the country, and finally, by the needs of the consumers and their ability to pay. But this is not what is involved here. The question is whether the rent that is paid by the poorest land goes into the price of its product, which by our assumption is what governs the general market price, in the same way that a tax goes into the price of the commodity on which it is levied, i.e. as an element independent of its value, see tariffs. This by no means follows necessarily and is asserted only because of the distinction between the value of commodities and their price of production has as yet not been understood. We've already seen that the price of production of a commodity is not at all identical with its value, although the production prices of commodities, when considered in their totality, are governed only by their total value. And although the movement in production prices for commodities of different kinds, all other circumstances remaining the same, is determined exclusively by the movement of their values. It has been shown that the production price of a commodity may stand above or below its value and will only coincide with it in exceptional cases. But the fact that agricultural products are sold above their price of production by no means proves that they are also sold above their value. Just as the fact that industrial products are sold on average at their price of production does not show that they are sold at their value. It is possible for agricultural products to be sold above their price of production and below their value, just as industrial products yield their price of production only because they are sold above their value. Whew. The relationship of a commodity's price of production to its value is determined exclusively by the proportion between the variable part of the capital with which it is produced and the constant part, or in other words, by the organic composition of the capital producing it. But if the composition of capital in one sphere of production is lower than that of the average social capital, i.e., if its variable component, that laid out in wages, is greater in comparison with the average social capital than its constant component, that laid out on the objective conditions of labor, the value of the commodity it produces must stand above its price of production. That is to say, such a capital produces more surplus value given the same exploitation of labor, and therefore more profit than an equally large aliquot part of the average social capital because it applies more living labor. The value of its product, therefore, stands above its price of production, since this price of production is equal to the capital that's been consumed, its cost of production, plus the average profit, and the average profit is lower than the produced profit contained in the commodity. The surplus value produced by the average social capital is less than the surplus value produced by a capital of this lower composition. The reverse is true if the capital invested in a particular sphere of production is higher in composition than the average social capital. The value of the commodities it produces then stands below the price of production, which is generally the case with products of the most highly developed industries. This is generally a question of, a comment on scale also. Anyway, if the capital in a particular sphere of production has a lower composition than the average social capital, this is firstly only a different expression for the fact that the productivity of social labor in this particular sphere of production stands below the average level of its development. For the level of productivity attained is expressed in the relative preponderance of the constant portion of capital over the variable, or in the steady decline of that component of a given capital laid out in wages. If the capital in a particular sphere of production has a higher composition, on the other hand, this expresses a level of development of the productivity of social labor which stands higher than the average. Leaving aside actual artistic works, you see, all of this above, it has that exception proviso. Leaving aside actual artistic works, which are excluded from our subject by the very nature of the case, it is self-evident that different spheres of production, according to their technical characteristics, require differing proportions of constant and variable capital, and that living labor must play a greater part in some and a smaller part in others. In extractive industry, like mines, for example, which should be sharply distinguished from agriculture, raw material completely disappears as an element in the constant capital, and even ancillary materials play a significant role only very occasionally. From the economic point of view, one can identify the ancillary material with the raw material. In the mining industry, however, the other part of constant capital, which consists of fixed capital and so on, does play a significant role. Even so, here too, as for example in the iron industry, we can measure the progress of industry by the relative growth in constant capital in comparison with the variable capital. If the composition of capital in agriculture proper is lower than the social average, this is prima facie an expression of the fact that in countries of developed capitalist production, agriculture has not progressed to the same extent as manufactured manufacturing industry. It has progressed relatively less than manufacturing industry. This, therefore, refers not to the progress of agriculture, but to its degree of progress. Now, leaving aside all other economic conditions which have a partially determinant effect, facts of this kind are explicable simply in terms of the earlier and more rapid development of the mechanical sciences, and especially of their application compared with the later and in part still very recent development of chemistry, geology, and physiology, and their application to agriculture in particular. It is also an indubitable and well-known fact that advances in agriculture are themselves always expressed in a relative growth in the constant portion of capital as against the variable portion of capital, whether the composition of whether the composition of agricultural capital is lower than the social average in a specific country where the capitalist mode of production predominates, as in England, for example, is a question that can be settled only by statistical investigation, yes, and into which it would be superfluous to go into detail for our purposes. Gee. In any case, it still holds, theoretically, that it is only on this premise that the value of agricultural products can rise above their price of production, i.e., that the surplus value produced in agriculture by a capital of a given size, or this comes to the same thing, by the surplus labor that it sets in motion and commands, hence also the total living labor applied, is greater than for a capital of the same magnitude of the socially average composition. For the magnitude of the capital consumed in the course of production, or the actual cost of production, is immaterial in establishing the price of production. It is equal to K plus P prime, where K, the cost price, is variable. But P prime always expresses the same proportional surplus value proportional to the capital advanced. This assumption is therefore sufficient as far as the form of rent we're examining here is concerned, and it is a necessary assumption for this rent to arise. Where this hypothesis is inapplicable, the form of rent corresponding to it also disappears. The fact, however, that there is a surplus in the value of agricultural products over and above their price of production would by no means be sufficient in itself to explain the existence of a ground rent independent of differences in fertility between different types of land or successive investments of capital on the same land. In short, of a rent conceptually distinct from differential rent, which can therefore denote as absolute rent. You can sort of see where he's going here, and you can see why some people might set absolute rent as zero or whatever. Anyway, a whole number of manufacturing products are characterized by a value above their price of production without thereby yielding a surplus over and above the average profit, a surplus profit that could be transformed into rent. The existence and the concept of the price of production and the general rate of profit, which includes this, rest on the fact that commodities are not sold at their values. The prices of production rise from an adjustment of commodity values under which, after the reimbursement of the respective capital values consumed in the various spheres of production, the total surplus value is distributed not in the proportion in which it is produced. Come on, move. Damn it. Produced in the individual spheres of production, or, in other words, not in the proportion in which the capitals of the various spheres of production set surplus labor in motion, and hence contained in their product, but rather in proportion to the size of the capitals advanced. It is only in this way that an average profit arises and a production price for commodities can be arrived at, the characteristic elements of which is this average profit. It is the constant tendency of capitals to bring about by competition this equalization in the distribution of the surplus value that the total capital produces, and to overcome all obstacles to it. It is therefore their tendency not to tolerate such surplus profits as arise under whatever circumstances, not from the differences between the values of the commodities and their prices of production, but rather from the general price of production governing the market and the individual production prices deriving from this. Surplus profits, which therefore do not arise between two different spheres of production, but rather within each sphere of production, so that they do not affect the general production prices of the different spheres, i.e. the general rate of profit, but rather presuppose the transformation of value into price of production. Now, this equalization of surplus value, however, depends, as already explained, on the continuously changing proportionate distribution of the total social capital and emigration of capitals, on their transferability from one sphere to another. In short, on their free movement between these various spheres of production as so many variable fields of employment for the independent parts of the total social capital. It is assumed in this connection that no barriers, or at least only accidental and temporary ones, prevent the competition of capitals. For example, in a sphere of production where the value of commodities stands above their price of production, or where the surplus value produced stands above the average profit, from reducing value to price of production, and thereby distributing the excess surplus value of this sphere of production. If the opposite occurs, that is, if capital comes against an alien power, which it can overcome only partly or not at all, a power which restricts its investment in particular spheres of production, allowing this only under conditions that completely or partially exclude the above-mentioned general equalization of surplus value to give an average profit, it is clear that in these spheres of production, a surplus profit will arise from the excess of commodity value above its price of production, which is transformed into rent, and as such can become autonomous vis-a-vis profit. So it's a very tightly bound idea here. And it is an alien power, and a barrier of this kind, that landed property confronts capital over its investment in the land, or that the landowner confronts the capitalist. A lot of work there, but you can see, I think that, he's looking at everything that sort of functions against sort of other, if we were talking about, I guess, codes of capital or something else, that there's something else that's going on here, and which, inevitably leads to legalisms, I suppose. Here, landed property is the barrier that does not permit any new capital investment on formerly uncultivated or unleased land without levying a toll, i.e. demanding a rent, even if the land newly brought under cultivation is of a kind which does not yield any differential rent, and which, if it had not been for landed property, could have been cultivated already with a smaller rise in the market price, so that the governing market price would have paid the tiller of the worst land only his price of production. But as a result of the barrier that landed property sets up, the market price must rise to a point at which the land can pay a surplus over the price of its production, i.e. a rent. Since, however, the value of the commodities produced by agricultural capital stands above their price of production, on our assumption, this rent forms the excess of the value above the price of production, or a part of this excess, except for one case that will be examined straight away. Whether the rent is equal to the whole difference between the value and the price of production, or only to a greater or lesser part of the difference, depends entirely on the state of supply in relation to demand, and on the extent of the area newly brought into cultivation. As long as the rent is not equal to the excess of the value of the agricultural products over their price of production, one part of this surplus always goes into the general equalization and proportionate distribution of all the surplus value among the various individual capitals. As soon as the rent is equal to the excess of the value over the price of production, this entire part of the extra surplus value, the excess of surplus value over and above the part of surplus value measured in line with the average profit, would be withdrawn from the process of equalization and proportionate distribution of the surplus value or surplus labor among the capitals of the various spheres of production. But whether this absolute rent is equal to the whole extra value over and above the price of production, or only part of this, agricultural products are always sold at a monopoly price, not because their price stands above their value, but rather because it is equal to their value, or is in an intermediate position between their value and the prices of production. These products have a monopoly because their value is not leveled down to their price of production as it is with other industrial products whose values stand above the general price of production. Since one part of the value and price of production is in fact an empirically given constant, namely the cost price, the capital equals K consumed in the course of production, the distinction lies in the other part, the variable part, the surplus value, which as an element in the price of production equals P, the profit, i.e., the total surplus value reckoned on the social capital and on each individual capital as an aliquot part of this, but which is the value of the commodity, but which in the value of the commodity is equal to the actual surplus value which this particular capital has produced, which depends on the quantity of surplus labor it sets in motion, forming an integral part of the commodity value it has created. If the value of a commodity is above its price of production, the price of production equals K plus P, and its value equals K plus P plus delta, so that P plus delta, the surplus value contained in it, P plus sigma equals the surplus value contained in it. The difference between the value and the price of production, P plus K plus delta minus K plus P is thus delta. The excess of the surplus value produced by this capital over the surplus value allocated to it by the general rate of profit. It follows from this that the price of agricultural products can stand above their price of production without reaching their value. It also follows that up to a certain point, there could be a continuous rise in the prices of agricultural products before their price has reached their value. It equally follows that it is only as a result of the monopoly of landed property that the excess value of agricultural products over their price of production at a particular moment can come to be their general market price. It finally follows that in this case, it is not the rise in the product's price that is the cause of the rent, but rather the rent that is the cause of the rise in its price. If the price of the product from the worst land, P plus R, all the differential rents will rise by corresponding multiples of R, since by our assumption P plus R becomes the governing market price. If the average composition of the non-agricultural social capital were C, C85, V15, and the rate of surplus value 100%, the price of production would be 115. If the composition of the agricultural capital were 75, C75, V25, the value of its product and the governing market value would be 125, given the same rate of surplus value. If the agricultural and non-agricultural products balanced out to give an average price, the total surplus value would be 15 plus 25, which equals 40, which amounts to 20% on a capital of 200. The product of each would be sold at 120. Given an equalization of production prices, therefore, the production prices, hence the average market prices of the non-agricultural products would rise and those of the agricultural products fall. If the agricultural products were sold at their full value, they would rise by the surplus value of 10, and the industrial products would stand 5 lower than if this equalization took place. If market conditions do not permit agricultural products to be sold at their full value at the total surplus over their price of production, the effect lies between the two extremes. Industrial products would be sold somewhat above their value, and agricultural products somewhere above their price of production. Now, although landed property can drive the price of the products of the soil above their price of production, it does not depend on landed property, but rather on the general state of the market. See, organic or, whatever, genetically modified, whatever. How far the market price rises above the price of production and towards the value, and to what extent, therefore, the surplus value produced over and above the given average profit in agriculture is either transformed into rent or goes into the general equalization of surplus value that settles the average profit. In any case, this absolute rent arising from the excess value over and above the price of production is simply part of the agricultural surplus value. The transformation of this surplus value into rent, its seizure by the landowner, just as differential rent arises from the transformation of surplus profit into rent, its seizure by landed property at the general governing price of production. These two forms of rent, therefore, are the only normal ones. Apart from this, rent can derive only from a genuine monopoly price, which is determined neither by the price of production of the commodities nor by their value, but rather by the demand of the purchasers and their ability to pay, consideration of which therefore belongs to the theory of competition, where the actual movement of market prices is investigated. So he's separating, in that sense, the difference between the production side and the distribution side relative to, trying to figure out whether, well, in my looking at it, is the problem of predation, but that's another thing. If all the land of a country that is suitable for agriculture were leased out, assuming the capitalist mode of production and normal conditions everywhere, there would be no land that did not yield rent, but there could be capital investments, particularly portions of capital invested on the land, equipment, etc., that did not yield rent. For once the land is leased out, landed property ceases to operate as an absolute barrier to the capital investment needed. It continues to operate as a relative barrier, even then, insofar as the reversion to the landowner of the capital incorporated into the soil sets the farmer very definite barriers. In this case, though, all rent would be transformed into a differential rent determined not by differences in the quality of the soil, but by the differences between the surplus profit arising after the final capital investment on the land and the rent that would be paid for the lease of the land of the worst class. Landed property operates as an absolute barrier only inasmuch as any permission to use land as a field of employment for capital requires that a tribute be paid to the landowner. Once this permission has been given, the landowner can no longer place any absolute barrier to the quantitative level of capital investment on a given piece of land. On the case of building of houses, for example, a barrier is always imposed by the property of a third party in the land on which the house is to be built. But once this land is leased for house building purposes, it depends on the lessee of the land whether he plans to erect a large house on it or a small house on it. If the average composition of agricultural capital were the same as that of the average social capital, or even higher, the result would be the disappearance of absolute rent in the sense developed above, namely a rent that is different from both differential rent and from rent depending on an actual monopoly price. This is because the value of the agricultural product would then not stand above its price of production, and agricultural capital would not set more labor in motion and would thus not realize more surplus labor than non-agricultural capital. The same thing would happen if, with the progress of agriculture, the composition of agricultural capital became equalized with that of the average social capital. At first sight, it may seem a contradiction to assume that on the one hand, the composition of the agricultural capital becomes higher, with its constant part growing vis-a-vis its variable part, while on the other hand, the price of agricultural products rises high enough, to enable new and worse land than previously to pay a rent, which in this case could derive only from an excess of the market price over the value and the price of the product. In other words, could derive only from a monopoly price for the product. Now, as Marx says, a distinction needs to be made here. We started to consider the formation of the rate of profit. We saw that capitals, which are technologically speaking of similar composition, i.e. set the same amount of labor in motion in proportion to machinery and raw material, may be still composed differently because of the differing values of their constant capital components. The raw material or machinery may, for example, be dearer in one case than the other, digging coal as opposed to digging, gold. In order to set the same amount of labor in motion, and this was necessary on our assumption to work up the same amount of raw material, a larger capital would have to be advanced in one case than in the other, since with a capital of 100, for example, I cannot set in motion the same labor if raw material that has to be purchased out of the 100 costs in the one case 40 and in the other case 20. But we should immediately see if the price of the dearer raw material sinks down to the level of that of the cheaper one, that these capitals are nonetheless similar in their technological composition. The value ratio between variable and constant capital would then be the same, although no change had taken place in the technological proportion between the living labor applied and the quantity and nature of the condition of labor required. A capital of lower organic composition, on the other hand, considered simply in terms of its value composition, could in appearance rise to the same level as a capital of higher organic composition simply by an increase in the value of its constant parts. If we take, for example, a capital composed as C4V1 because it used a great deal of machinery and raw material in relation to living labor power, and another capital of C1V4, which uses a lot of living labor, little machinery, and little and cheap raw material in relation to labor power, so that a simple rise in the value of the raw material and ancillary materials could equalize its composition, so that out of the 100, 4/5 would be constant capital and 1/5 variable capital. The fourfold labor power would still have to be set in motion as before in order to work on the same amount of raw material. Capitals of the same organic composition can thus have a differing value composition, and capitals of the same value composition in percentage terms can stand at varying levels of organic composition, displaying various different levels of development of the social productivity of labor. Thus, the mere fact that the agricultural capital now stood at the same level by value composition would not prove that the social productivity of labor was equally highly developed. All it could show would be that its own product, which again forms part of its conditions of production, is dearer, or that ancillary materials such as fertilizer, which is used to be obtained locally, now have to be carried a long way. Now, leaving this aside, however, we have the particular character of agriculture to consider. Assume that labor-saving machinery, chemical aids, etc., take a greater share in the process, and also the reduction in the amount of labor needed to sow a different quantity of seed, perhaps by means of sowing machines, seed sowing machines, so that there are more seeds per worker. Assume, therefore, that the constant capital grows technologically, not just in value, but in quantity, in its proportion to the amount of labor power applied in the case of agriculture, as with the mining industry. This is not just a matter of an increase in the social, but also the natural productivity of labor, which depends on the productivity of the soil. It depends on the natural conditions of labor. It is possible. Excuse me. It is possible for a decline in natural productivity or not even to do this much. And this compensation can only be effective for a certain period, so that despite the technical development, the product does not become cheaper, but is simply prevented from becoming dearer. It is also possible in a situation of rising corn prices for the absolute amount produced to decline. But this affects capital that consists, for the most part, of machinery, also of cattle, where only the depreciation has to be replaced. The variable capital, meanwhile, the capital laid out in wages, always has to be replaced completely from the product. And here, the decline in the absolute amount of product is accompanied by a relative increase in the surplus product. But it's also possible that as agriculture progresses, only a moderate rise in the market price above the average will be needed for poorer land, which, given a lower level of assistance from industrial aids, would have required a greater rise in the market price to be cultivated and also to yield a certain amount of rent. The fact that in stock raising, for example, the amount of labor power applied is on the whole very small compared with the constant capital existing in the livestock themselves, which could be taken as a decisive objection to the contention that agricultural capital in percentage terms sets more labor power in motion than does non-agricultural capital of the average social composition. It's more complicated than that, but anyway. It should be noted here, however, that in explaining rent, we take as the initial determinant that section of agricultural capital which produces the decisive cereal foodstuffs, and thus the major means of subsistence for all civilized people. Adam Smith has already shown, and this is one of his services to our understanding of the matter, that the rents in stock raising And in the general average of all capital invested on the land that does not go into the production of the main means of subsistence, such as corn forever, for instance, are subject to a completely different price determination. Prices here are determined by the fact that the price of the product of land, which is used, say, as an artificial pasture for cattle, but which could equally well be turned into arable land of a certain quality, has to rise enough to yield the same rent as equally good arable land. In this case, therefore, the rent of the corn-growing land is a determining factor in the price of cattle, so that Ramsay was correct to note that in this way, the price of cattle is artificially raised by rent, by the economic expression of landed property, and thus by landed property itself. Footnote 34. By the extension, besides, of cultivation, the unimproved wilds become insufficient to supply the demand for butcher's meat. A great deal of the cultivated lands must be employed in rearing and fattening cattle, of which the price, therefore, must be sufficient to pay not only the labor necessary for tending them, but the rent which the landlord and the profit which the farmer could have drawn from such land employed in tillage. The cattle bred upon the most uncultivated moors, when brought to the same markets, are, in proportion to their weight or goodness, sold at the same price as those which are reared upon the most improved land. The proprietors of those moors profit by it and raise the rent of their land in proportion to the price of their cattle. That's Smith, footnote 36. In this case, too, the differential rent, as distinct from the corn rent, is in favor of the inferior land. Absolute rent explains certain phenomena which at first sight make rent appear to be due to a mere monopoly price. Take, for instance, the owner of a woodland that exists without any human action, i.e. not as the result of afforestation in Norway, for example, and appended to Adam Smith's example. If he is paid a rent by a capitalist who has timber felled, perhaps to meet a demand from England, he is paid a greater or lesser rent in timber over and above the profit on the capital advanced. This seems in the case of its purely natural product to be a simple monopoly surcharge. In actual fact, however, the capital here consists almost solely of variable capital laid out on labor, which therefore sets more surplus labor in motion than another capital of the same size. The value of the timber thus contains a greater excess of unpaid labor or surplus value than the product of capitals of higher composition. The average profit can thus be paid from the timber, while a significant excess accrues to the owner of the woodland in the form of rent. We may assume, conversely, that given the case with which the felling of timber can be extended, and this production thus very rapidly increased, the demand would have to rise very considerably to make the price of timber equal to its value, so that the entire excess of unpaid labor, over and above the part that falls to the share of the capitalist as average profit, would accrue to the proprietor in the form of rent. Side note, you could we in fact apply this to the Lumberton of Blue Velvet or the mills of Twin Peaks? But anyway, we have assumed that land newly brought into cultivation is of inferior quality to the worst of the land previously cultivated. If it is better, it bears a differential rent. Here, however, we're investigating precisely the case where rent does not appear as differential rent. There are only two possible alternatives at this point. Either the land newly taken up is worse than, or is just as good as, the land previously cultivated. We've already investigated the position where it is worse. What we now have to investigate is where it is just as good. Equally good land, and even better, can be newly cultivated as agriculture develops just as much as worse land can, as we have already shown in the case of differential rent. Firstly, because in the case of differential rent and rent in general, since even in the case of non-differential rent, the question always still arises of whether the fertility of the land on the one hand and its location on the other permitted to be cultivated at all at the governing market price with profit and rent. Whether the market price is high enough always depends on these two conditions of fertility and location. two factors operate in opposite direction. Sometimes they counterbalance each other, and sometimes one outweighs the other. A rise in market price, assuming that the means of cultivation remain the same and that mechanical progress or progress of another kind does not form a new element which does not previously fall into the balance in favor of an extension of cultivation. Oh, the balance of in favor of an extension of cultivation, assuming in one word that the cost price of cultivation has not fallen, may bring into cultivation more fertile land, which was previously excluded from competing by its location. Or else, in the case of less fertile land, it may increase the advantage of location so much that this balances the low yield. I'm almost done. I should stop already because we're at yes, I have already exceeded my my limit here. Let me let's. We're at page 757, which means we've covered 20 pages, and we've still got a lot to go. I hope this was useful. There is, for me, it was pretty useful because what it did was describe a whole variety of terms under which Marx makes certain decisions upon the empirical estimation of things like price and tries to differentiate between, you know, the his issue of the difference between value and price because of all of these other contingencies, which are in fact quite historical and even philosophical in that sense. But anyway, we'll stop the live stream now to spare you whatever pain